like if you're going to make a giant open world game, you don't like place every little weed and rock by hand, because not only is that extremely labor intensive, but then you want to change it. Like, oh, I want a road to go through here, and I want to move all this up by like 100 feet and make a cliff, and like all the work was wasted, right? And so you tend to want higher level control. Like, so I've got a system that sprinkles rocks around, and I can control some parameters about how the rocks appear, right? And so instead of placing 1,000 individual rocks, I place this one thing, and then I tweak the parameters till I like it, and then I leave it. And then if I have to move it, I just have to move one thing instead of 1,000 rocks, right? And so that's the kind of tool that game content people have been using for a long time. Now, I will say, even at that level of technology that I've described, usually games are made with tools that are worse than what you would have liked to make that game. And so the workflow is never as good as what you would have wanted. But nevertheless, this has been an acknowledged part of game development for a long time. Okay, similarly, for texture maps, which is, if you come up to a surface in a game, you've got geometry of like the wall, which is like where are the triangles, but then you've got the bitmap that you spread on the wall, right, which is called a texture map for very arcane reasons that probably don't matter. And very often, in fact, probably almost never now are those hand painted in a high budget game. You'd use a synthesis tool, like Substance or something like that, which lets you generate a texture from higher level considerations. And again, you tweak it till you're happy. And then, making a wall is a series of higher level considerations. So like maybe I have a brick texture that I'm happy with, and I have a dirt texture that I'm happy with, and I've got an aged brick texture that I'm happy with. And now I'm going to hand paint something, but that thing is now just what is the blend between these different images on the wall. And so I still have a degree of authorship over the wall, but it's not pixel by pixel, right? And so that's what that looks like in that department, right? And so when you start looking at AI, you could start asking this question of how does it fit into this process? Because this is a process that we know is actually helpful, right? Like you could just imagine, right? Like, oh, maybe AI just makes the worlds for you or whatever, but are those worlds going to be fun? Probably not, right? Is it, and so you've got to imagine how to insert it into the process such that there's still a degree of authorship. If it's too low in the scale, maybe that doesn't help very much. Like if you have Substance Designer and you have this rich, I forget, there's Substance, whichever one is the texture map authoring one. So if you have this thing and you've got a library of materials that's very fast for you to sift through and search by keyword or whatever and blend, is it really going to help you that much to type into an LLM some English of give me a good brick wall texture? Because you would have just typed brick anyway and just done a regular keyword search and had all these materials, right? And so that's not very helpful. Maybe in the game engine, you could describe something more like, brick wall with dirt along the bottom, and that gives you something that you could tweak. Maybe.
I would think in game engines, it's a tool that I would like to see, at least, not so much for generating assets, but using AI, if you're making a game that is procedural, I think it could probably be a big help. If you already have a template that it could learn from, well, that's almost like, because I'm a self-taught programmer, I don't know most of the terminology. Is it wave function collapse? Where it takes a pattern and it can create permutations of that pattern. Is that? No, I'm thinking of something else.
Wave function collapse is a name for a thing that I don't like because it's playing on the quantum mechanics idea of wave function collapse, but it's one particular method that someone popularized that existed for decades before this, about if you have an open world that's potentially infinite and you're going to move around it and you want to generate new things that are consistent with all the old things, right? that was the wave function collapse algorithm, so called. But I don't have great respect for wave function collapse algorithm because I don't, whatever. It's a redo of things that had been done many times before under different names.
I'm thinking AI might be useful in that sense, at least as an initial setup, to be able to say, hey, look at our surroundings. This is what you got. This is kind of what you're going for. Here's maybe, instead of here's something brand new that we're trying to build from scratch, here are more stylized permutations that follow the same rule sets that you've given us before. It's almost like writing your own procedural algorithm, but it's this AI that's doing it. I think that could be helpful and useful, especially like you were talking about for, hey, I'm going to place this rock here, 1,000 rocks here. We're not going to place them all by hand, stuff like that.
Well,
I can see
it also
AI
depends.
Go on.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, don't let me interrupt you. I think that's
no,
good.
sorry. I was just going to say that it also, I think it would be a decent help like that too. But we also have a lot of geometry painting tools and stuff like that, that we use now. But I'm more of a programmer. I don't do a lot of the artwork, so I'm not familiar with all the tools that are available. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it can be an iterative process of experimentation and discovery. However, I think what both of us are imagining so far in this discussion is AI that's approximately as intelligent as the systems that we've seen, and then how would you deploy that, right? And so the wild card is always like, what if you actually get AI that's smart and proactively thinking and problem solving the way a person can be, right? Then all of a sudden it's more like an actual member of the team as opposed to a tool slot in a tool thing, right? And that's a little bit more science fiction-y, but I don't think that's off the table. I think that could happen. That could happen, this year for all I know, just because a lot of the previous big advancements were really big surprises. Or it could not happen for 20 years, right?
Right.
Or it could not happen ever because it's impossible. Like we just don't know. So, yeah. It's hard to predict these things, right?
Yeah, especially like you're saying with AI, because it's up in the air right now. We could hope that it's going to do good things. We don't know. Maybe this will be it. Like maybe we can't go further for whatever reason. I don't think that's the case, but like you never know. And that's but I'm always interested. Obviously, I love technology. I'm always interested in new technology. But in terms of like the broader AI discussion that we've been having and whether or not it's actually useful to implement now, rather than just it's a fun toy that you look at every once in a while to see how it's doing. And I think it's more, for me, it's more of a, like I said, it's a fun toy that you just look at, like, oh, look at that flower trying to grow. Like, we'll wait till you get a little bit bigger before that's kind of my thought on it in terms of AI.
Okay, since we've said a lot of counter hype things, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like both of us are not fully convinced by the hype. There are some things that AI is good for, right? So like idea generation. Like if you're just riffing with an LLM, like whatever. I think most of the ideas it would come up with are not that good, but once in a while it's like, oh yeah, I wouldn't have thought of that myself. Also with image generation, like maybe you're not going to get something you could use, but you could do some style experimentation to just sort of vaguely see what something might kind of look like. And then that's a lot faster than if you did that manually. And then you say, okay, I want something like this, and I'm going to have to paint it myself or something, but at least I have a proof of concept, right?
I can see that.
For programming, I would not at all use one of these systems to actually generate code. If I found out someone on the team was doing this, I would certainly have a stern talk with them to cease and desist immediately. Fortunately, because we use our own programming language, the LLMs are not really trained on it. So results are probably even worse and not usable. So for example, if it's like, hey, so just the other day, I was like, I need to go do Windows raw input stuff. Like, what are the API calls that I need? And you could ask an LLM that, and it'll generally pretty much give you the right answer about what are the relevant functions and stuff. It could mislead you a little bit, but it'll often be better than the available documentation because documentation is notoriously horrible, right? And so that's really helpful. And so those are the ways in which I would use state-of-the-art AI, but this may change by next year, right?
I do think I would like to see, especially like you were saying, especially when documentation, oh my God. Just using anything, Unreal, Unity. Like, oh my goodness, I can just laugh at it. But it will be interesting to like just to train AI on just that alone, like documentation or basic stuff that not as a general purpose, but as a highly tuned AI towards a specific set. I think we can get a little bit more leverage out of it that way. I'm not all doom and gloom on AI. I do think that there is a place for it in the future.
I think it makes for a good tool, but not a replacement for people.
Right. The scary part everyone's worried about is if it becomes a replacement, because then where will the jobs go? That's what I think a lot of people are worried about.
If that happens, though, you have a second order problem, right? Which is, so the first order problem is obviously we don't need to hire as many people to make these games, right? But if it's mostly not people making games, the market is going to be flooded with even more games than we already have, and they're probably going to kind of all be copies of each other. And so there's going to be way more of a trash game problem than we have right now, right? And so then does the industry collapse? Do people just stop looking for? So, for example, on the, when the iPhone came out, I was like, oh, this is such a cool platform for games. It's just touch and it's responsive and all that. And then those games became dominated by, I don't even know what's like. I haven't looked in years at the regular App Store, like top 10 games. Yeah, but it's all been dominated by this style of game that I'm just fully not interested in. So if I look on iOS at all, I would look on Apple Arcade. But even there is like, a lot of these games are just not, I don't think of them as real games, And so what happens if Steam and all game consoles become that way as well due to like AI crappy game flood? What happens? Does the whole industry basically die, right? I don't know.
Anna and I have discussed this before. I think it's going to be like that scene in Secret of Monkey Island where you go in the back alley and the guy with the trench coat, he's the one selling the maps in Monkey Island, but we're going to be selling games made by actual humans to people on the street. Well, I think that's going to eventually happen.
A little bit like dystopian, there's a logo like Energy Star or whatever. There might be a logo like designed and crafted by humans.
Human made, yeah.
There might be. I think I do think that we're going to see. Elon mentioned this. He wants to start an AI game studio. Again, I don't think AI is there yet, but I do think in the future, I think people will be like, there was a lot of consumers that just really don't care. They just want stuff to flash all over the screen and they want the points numbers to constantly come up. It's games made for people with ADD, basically.
Yeah.
But other people I think are going to be yearning for that fingerprint, because you only get that fingerprint from a real human being. AI doesn't have a fingerprint. You look at an artist, even if they're trying to do the same style of line art as like a different artist, there's going to be something that's just a little bit different about it. Maybe it's the palettes that they use. It's their pen strokes, like everything, these tiny little fingerprints that we see. And I don't think AI is going to be able to replicate that at all. And I think that's going to show through with games, like we were talking about earlier with developers and publishers, how you can, how they treat what they think of their consumers by how they present the material to them.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be the same way with AI. Factually true. However, it may not matter that it's factually true. So if you take just image generation right now, if you take, generate a painting in the style of Matisse, right? Mm-hmm. And then you put a real Matisse next to it to somebody who's never seen that painting before, right? Because obviously super famous paintings you would know. And you just did a quiz where it's like, pick the real one and not the AI generated one. I'm not sure most people would score well on that quiz, even though a very experienced artist might get a perfect score, right? Mm. Like someone who's really trained in what does it take to generate images and what would somebody making a very high quality thing care about and all that would be able to spot these signs, but I'm not sure that I would be able to, right? And so maybe it's going to be like that for games. I don't know. Games, if anything. So I'm a designer. Design is very subtle and invisible. It's way more invisible than like paint on canvas. And so if anything, I would expect it to be harder for design than art to notice the difference.
I think that there'll be a niche market for human-made products, just like you see in a lot of other production. You can have the furniture that's made off, the assembly line, and it's going to be the same as everybody else's, or you can get something handcrafted. So
It's
I
like-
Quite
think
possible. Yeah.
Yeah, back in the day, that the explosion of homebrew and flash games and whatnot, there's people that just like love that stuff.